Fat loss is a pretty popular topic, and for most people, it's their main goal. They just want to lose fat. It is true that the majority of population tends to carry too much body fat, and they're eager to lose it somehow. Losing fat does take some effort, but it's not nearly as difficult as actually losing your fat cells. This video talks about why you can't lose fat cells after gaining fat, and what to do about it.
Fat.
One 2008 study claimed that the number of fat cells stays constant around adulthood in lean and obese individuals, even after marked weight loss. Instead, you gain most of your fat cells in your childhood and adolescence. During adulthood, the number stays relatively constant unless you go through massive swings in weight. Your fat cells are in constant turnover and renewed at a rate of approximately 10% every year at all ages and body mass indexes. This is just the basal cell turnover and recycling that involves regular fat oxidation as well as autophagy. Losing fat mass involves shrinking the already existing fat cells, but not losing them beyond the basal rate of cell turnover. When you gain weight, these fat cells will increase in size. There are also certain fat cell precursors that will be turned into adipose tissue after gaining weight. If you lose body fat and shrink fat cells, the body responds by triggering mechanisms that make further fat loss harder and promote easier weight regain. For example, losing weight decreases leptin, the satiety hormone, and increases ghrelin, the hunger hormone. Your fat cells basically scream out to be refilled because they want you to gather as much energy as possible. That's why the majority of people can't maintain their new weight and they tend to rebound. If you want to avoid excess amounts of fat cells, then you shouldn't get fat in the first place, especially in your childhood and adolescence. Otherwise, fat loss is gonna be much harder for you in your later life. But this doesn't mean that you can't lose weight or get lean. Losing fat and getting lean is not the same as losing fat cells. The cells are just containers of fat and lipids that fill up based on your energy influx. If you burn more energy than you consume, the body will pull the calories it needs from the fat cells, thus they shrink in size. As a result, you will also look leaner. You can have a ton of fat cells and still look lean with a six-pack because the fat cells have shrunk down and they don't contain excess energy. Likewise, you can have little to no fat cells but still look chubby because the individual fat cells are enlarged and they carry more fat per cell. So anyone can lose fat regardless of their fat cell composition.
Do it.
To lose body fat, you have to first quote-unquote release it from the adipose stores. This process is called lipolysis, during which your body breaks down stored fat molecules called triglycerides. Lipophagy is the degradation of fatty acids, triglycerides, and cholesterol by autophagy. It contributes to lipid droplet degradation in many cell types. Lipophagy uses acid lipolysis in lysosomes to degrade cellular triglycerols, which store free fatty acids. Lipid stores are metabolized by lipophagy to fuel mitochondrial beta oxidation and regulated to maintain energy homeostasis. Impaired lipophagy promotes fatty liver and dysregulates body mass. How many lipids get degraded by lipophagy depends on the supply of extracellular nutrients and overall calorie balance. The cells just adjust the amount of lipophagy based on their nutritional status and energy intake. Triglycerides are digested and shuttled into the mitochondria to produce ATP. ATP is the energy currency used to carry out virtually every physiologic process, like breathing, walking, exercising, and digesting food. How many calories you burn a day is determined by your metabolic rate and total daily energy expenditure. Your total daily energy expenditure is the total amount of energy you're burning during a 24-hour period. This number is determined by your basal metabolic rate, daily physical activity, hormones, medical condition, metabolic status, and what food you eat in what amounts. If you want to shrink fat cells, then you have to gradually lose your body fat and get to a lower body weight and prevent rebounding, because this kind of yo-yo dieting is also actually teaching your body to get fatter and regain it more easily. Gaining weight, rebounding, and yo-yo dieting is the worst thing that you can do because you're actually creating new fat cells that you previously didn't have. A 2015 study from Yale found that the creation of new fat cells was governed by a key nutrient sensing pathway called P3 kinase AKT2. Mice who were fed a high-fat obesogenic diet started producing these precursor cells within 24 hours of overeating. However, the development of white adipose tissue doesn't require AKT, which means you can gain body fat without this signaling pathway, but you need it for initiating the growth of new fat precursor cells. P3 kinase AKT2 is part of the mTOR and insulin IGF-1 pathway that regulates growth and anabolism. You need the activation of mTOR to promote protein synthesis, grow muscle cells, enlarge an already existing muscle cells, cell proliferation, growth of neurons, and as it turns out, fat cells as well. Insulin promotes the storage of nutrients and also the growth of new cells through mTOR and AKT2. Bodybuilders have known this for decades, and they use injectable insulin to promote muscle growth and hypertrophy. However, it's also known that insulin promotes lipohypertrophy, or the expansion of fat cells. If type 2 diabetics inject insulin to their abdominal region, they see localized lipohypertrophy and potentially lipoatrophy. That's why they rotate injection sites. Furthermore, insulin also inhibits autophagy, thus suppressing lipophagy and decreasing the turnover of fat cells. Elevation of this anabolic cascade, insulin, mTOR, and AKT, is going to promote the growth of all cells, whether that be muscle cells, fat cells, or even some malignant cells. Which of these cells begins to predominate and which is going to gain most of the benefits from this growth depends on the particular energy status and also the metabolic situation of the individual. If someone is working out with resistance training, then activating AKT and insulin will predominantly lead to more muscle hypertrophy as opposed to fat cell hypertrophy because they just activated mTOR in the muscle cells. On the other hand, a sedentary person, they would see more growth in their fat cells because they lack the stimulus for muscle growth, and the body would prefer storing calories rather than expending them for building muscle. Things that raise mTOR include protein, amino acids, carbohydrates, insulin, and calories in general. Overeating in general and eating too frequently will also raise mTOR. Exercise and resistance training also turn on mTOR, but they do so primarily in muscle tissue. That's exactly what you want. You're gonna get site-specific mTOR activation in muscle cells that will increase your lean body mass and insulin sensitivity. Having more muscle makes it easier to lose fat because of increased energy expenditure, metabolic rate, and glucose tolerance. If you activate mTOR and insulin at the right time in the right amounts, then you can actually make your body healthier, stronger, and leaner at the same time. It's not black and white, but very much context dependent. Overall energy balance and energy intake determines fat cell shrinking and expansion. For example, high insulin and mTOR aren't going to grow new fat cells if you're already at a calorie deficit, but it might do so more easily if you're over-consuming calories. Unfortunately, higher insulin and mTOR probably also means that you're already eating more calories. Eating a high-fat diet with high insulin and carbs is the go-to method for making animals obese and sick in research. They're basically put on a junk food diet and they get fat really fast, as was shown by the previous study on the mice. This pattern is evident in humans as well, who eat a lot of processed foods and combine fats and carbs together. Basically, the fat plus carb combo is super obesogenic and promotes the growth of fat cell precursors in a calorie surplus because of the activation of AKT2 and insulin. It's less obesogenic in a calorie deficit because of decreased influx of energy, but it will still promote fat cell proliferation in people who lack the stimulus for mTOR in muscle cells.
Where's the fucking Twinkies?
So here are a few key ways of shrinking fat cells and preventing from growing them. Energy balance is king. Your overall calorie intake determines whether or not fat cells shrink or expand. To maintain a negative energy balance without feeling like you're starving, you have to eat high satiety and nutrient-dense foods. Generally, that tends to be protein plus fiber and vegetables. However, you have to find a diet that works for you. You don't need to be on a low-carb, low-insulin diet to lose fat, but in order to prevent unnecessary growth of fat cells, you should be mindful of how often and when you raise insulin. Energy balance is important, but spiking insulin several times throughout the day is probably not ideal. The best time to eat carbs and raise insulin is after resistance training because then the activation of mTOR AKT2 is used for muscle growth instead of fat cell growth. Raising insulin for people who are already overweight or who don't exercise would result in more fat growth as opposed to muscle growth. Any resistance training, whether that be with weights or calisthenics, promotes muscle growth and insulin sensitivity. You're going to trigger site-specific mTOR activation in muscle cells instead of fat cells, making the body store nutrients in your muscles as opposed to fat. Even if your goal isn't to build muscle, the sheer act of resistance training and depleting your glycogen promotes better nutrient partitioning, and you're going to improve your body composition with more lean muscle and less fat mass. Increasing autophagy will also encourage the turnover of fat cells and lipolysis. Intermittent fasting already suppresses insulin and helps stick to a calorie deficit, but it also promotes lipophagy, the oxidation of fat cells, by autophagy. I'm also taking digestive enzymes during the fasted state to increase the breakdown of triglycerols and lipids. Biooptimizer's Capex formula contains enzymes that break down proteins and fats and also promote ketogenesis. There are also compounds like betaine and dandelion root that support lipophagy. Cold exposure activates brown adipose tissue, which regulates heat production through shivering as well as non-shivering thermogenesis, as opposed to white fat that's used for only energy storage. Overeating calories and getting fat is going to promote the production of white fat, not brown fat. Basically, it's easier to burn brown fat because it's also used to keep you warm, whereas white fat is burned through calorie balance. Brown adipose tissue also makes you more insulin sensitive and regulates glucose homeostasis. In conclusion, losing fat cells doesn't really happen, and it's almost impossible to do it precisely to just abolish the fat cells that you already have. Whenever you do lose weight, then you're just shrinking the size of the fat cells. But the problem is that if you're already fat, then shrinking the fat cells also makes it more easier for you to refill those fat cells. And that's why people who go back and forth these yo-yo diets and they gain weight and lose weight really often, then for them future fat loss is much harder.
It's a trap!
Fortunately, as I just showed you, there are many things that you can do to direct the nutrient partitioning towards your muscle cells as opposed to your fat cells. And you have to just, choose the site-specific activation of these pathways and when you do activate them. If you want to know how to optimize intermittent fasting, resistance training for optimal autophagy, nutrient density, and strategic calorie restriction, then check out my Metabolic Autophagy Masterclass. But other than that, thanks for watching this video. Make sure you click the like, subscribe, notification bell as well. My name is Seam. Stay optimized, stay empowered.